Now, Manish, would you please introduce Andrea again and her speaking theme?
Okay. Thank you very much for this honor. Andrea, the only reason I even jumped in here because I was the accidental attendee. I forgot about the Central and the Eastern time zone changes, and I logged in at 12:15, not knowing that in the background, Zoom was running. So the moment a couple of the members joined in, including President Carlos From, they said, well, why don't you do the introduction for Andrea? So it's an honor to introduce you today, Andrea. So Andrea Wotan, for you members of the Rotary Club of Northbrook and of course our guests here and friends, she's a Rotarian for about 6 months, but grew up in, I think, Colorado, also worked as an investment banker in the Bay Area in San Francisco, has also lived in Israel, and what else can I tell you? And she is in Ann Arbor because her husband's doing his PhD degree at the University of Michigan in Middle Eastern Studies. And she herself is a graduate of the University of Michigan, having done a master's degree in, I believe, dietetics, Andrea, from the University of Michigan. And that's yes. How, and she belongs to a group, that is promoting plant-rich diets and vegan diets, etc., which is how one of my club's past presidents, Scott Nelson, initially came in contact with her and invited her to give a talk at our club about 7 months ago. And there's no looking back because Andrea is just a very, very both vivacious but very enthusiastic member of our club. And believe it or not, I have not met her in person. This is just face-to-face. You know, what you're seeing virtually is all we have here for the, because of the pandemic. But I know that Andrea is a phenomenal Rotarian. In the last week or so, Andrea, Don Byford, and Anju Madan, and myself, and a couple of other Rotarians from the Bay Area, who are all part of the Plant-Rich Diet Task Force, volunteered lots of hours at the Rotary International Convention's 3D booth that is set up by SRAG. So I think without further ado, I'd like to present you all Andrea Wotan.
Wow, thank you all so much. Thank you, Manish, for that wonderful introduction. And I just want to tell all of you how honored I am to be here with you today and how grateful I am for this opportunity. I actually was born and raised until I was 10 in Elgin, Illinois. So I have a very fond spot for Illinois and consider myself a Midwesterner, even though the rest of my upbringing was in Colorado. Okay, and I apologize for prematurely sharing my screen. I thought I was up and put it up. Okay, so let's see. All righty. Okay, so I would just invite all of you to fasten your seatbelts because I have a lot to share in 25 minutes. I'll go kind of fast, but I hope it'll be understandable. Okay, so before I begin, I really would love to urge all of you to read this brief article published in January of 2021 titled "Underestimating the Challenges of Avoiding a Ghastly Future." The authors expose the frightening fact that our planet is actually in much steeper decline than any of us realize. As we speak, our Earth is already fighting for her life in numerous ways. And most of us are simply not grasping the state of emergency that we're in. If we love our Earth, today is the day to challenge ourselves to selflessly support her in every way we can, including in what we eat. So today I am going to, oops, hold on. Today, I will be sharing with you why a shift to plant-rich diets is critical to saving our planet. Now, scientists from around the world are imploring humanity, especially those of us living in high-income and middle-income nations, to immediately shift to plant-rich diets as a non-negotiable strategy to save our planet. And the tragedy is that practically no one is listening. Now, why are scientists saying this? The global livestock industry, which supplies our meat, dairy, eggs, and farmed fish, is a leading cause of global greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. It's the leading driver of tropical deforestation and conversion of other habitats around the world. It's also a leading cause of global water pollution, water depletion, soil degradation, and the rise of antibiotic-resistant bacteria and zoonotic pathogens. And together, the global livestock and industrial fishing industries are leading drivers of species extinction and decline on land and in our oceans. Now, I'll focus primarily on climate change today, and we'll just scratch the surface of a couple of these other topics. And I'll be using the term plant-rich instead of plant-based because the Eat Lancet report, which was published in 2019, showed us that we can eat a small amount of animal source foods if desired and still meet both human health and planetary sustainability goals. Okay, climate change. In 2019, global anthropogenic or human-caused greenhouse gas emissions hit a record high of 59 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalents, or 59 billion metric tons. I'm using 2019 data since, to my knowledge, we don't yet have complete data for 2020. According to the UN, to avert the most catastrophic impacts of planetary warming, we must prevent global temperatures from rising more than 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Now, to do this, we need to reduce global emissions by 32 gigatons per year by the year 2030 to be on a path to net zero by 2050. So how much does the livestock industry contribute to global greenhouse gases? Well, estimates vary from 14.5% up to 51% of the global total. But for today, we'll use the estimate of 14.5% or 7.1 gigatons per year, which comes from a 2013 UN Food and Agriculture Organization, or FAO, report. Now, 14.5% is significant. It's not far below emissions from the entire global transportation sector, which contributed 15.9% in 2016. Now, these figures help us to understand the magnitude of livestock's contribution to greenhouse gas emissions, but a report published in November of 2020 really gets to the urgency of the matter. Researchers found that even if all non-food system greenhouse gas emissions, including fossil fuel emissions, were immediately stopped and were net zero from 2020 to 2100, emissions from the food system alone would likely exceed the 1.5 degrees Celsius emissions limit between the years 2051 and 2063. Now, considering that nearly 60% of food system emissions come from the livestock sector, it's no surprise that of the 5 food system strategies that the researchers evaluated for their greenhouse gas reduction potential, plant-rich diets reduced emissions the most and even came close to reaching the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal. Researchers concluded that at least partial adoption of plant-rich diets and the other 4 strategies is essential to meet climate targets. Now, what do these findings tell us? Even if we succeed in reducing emissions from fossil fuels at warp speed, there is no way to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius unless we change our diets. Now, 14.5% or 7.1 gigatons of global greenhouse gas emissions is a huge number, but even more significant than the volume is the composition of gases in that number. 50% are methane, 24% nitrous oxide, and 26% carbon dioxide. So let's talk about methane and nitrous oxide. The livestock sector is the world's #2 producer of human-caused methane, contributing 32%, just under the fossil fuel industry at 35%. And the livestock sector is the world's leading emitter of nitrous oxide at about 53%. Why is this important? Methane and nitrous oxide are particularly devastating to our climate because they trap far more heat in our atmosphere than does carbon dioxide. Over 100 years, methane traps about 34 times more heat than CO2. But since methane only lasts about 12 years versus CO2 that persists for hundreds to thousands of years, its impact over the first 20 years is higher, trapping 86 times more heat than CO2. Now, the atmosphere responds quickly to methane levels because of its short lifespan. And as the United Nations recently reported, cutting methane is the strongest lever we have to slow climate change over the next 25 years. Now, large amounts of methane are also emitted by leaks in oil and gas wells. But while most of us cannot fix leaks in oil and gas wells, we can change our diets starting today. Now, nitrous oxide is a climate super pollutant. It traps 298 times more heat than CO2 and is now the single greatest ozone depleting substance. As this journalist wrote, emissions of nitrous oxide are rising at a rate that not only threatens international targets to limit global warming, but is consistent with a worst case trajectory for climate change. Now, if much of the world adopts plant-rich diets, emissions of methane and nitrous oxide from the livestock sector would likely drop significantly. This won't solve our climate problems, but it will buy us desperately needed time to roll out green energy worldwide. So how does the livestock industry produce methane and nitrous oxide? Methane comes from the burps of ruminants, especially cows, but also sheep, goats, and buffalo due to a digestive process called enteric fermentation. It also comes from manure stored in liquid lagoons that are common on industrial pig and dairy farms. Considering that we have about 4.8 billion constantly burping and pooping cows, sheep, goats, buffalo, and pigs on the planet, this is a real problem. Nitrous oxide comes from the breakdown of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers used on feed crops and from manure left on pasture or spread on crops. So now let's talk about carbon dioxide. The livestock industry contributes between 5 and 9% of the world's CO2 emissions. CO2 emissions in the livestock sector arise primarily from land use change, fossil fuels used to make fertilizers and pesticides for feed crops, and from feed transportation and processing. Let's explore land use change. When we burn and destroy ecosystems like rainforests and grasslands to change them into cattle pasture and feed crops, the huge amount of carbon that was stored in the soil, trees, and other vegetation gets released into the atmosphere. The land goes from being a carbon sink, meaning it absorbs and stores carbon as depicted by the green arrows, to becoming a net emitter of carbon dioxide as depicted by the red arrows. Tropical deforestation alone is responsible for about 8% of CO2 emissions, and the livestock sector is the #1 human driver of tropical deforestation. So what would happen if we were to eat less meat, causing the livestock sector to downsize? Well, first, we'd save a lot of rainforests, savannas, and grasslands from destruction. Second, a lot of the world's land that's currently used for pasture and feed crops could theoretically be released back to nature for rewilding or restoration of native ecosystems. These lands could once again become carbon sinks and remove CO2 from our atmosphere. Now, a study published in 2020 looked at this exact scenario. Researchers found that if we just keep eating and eating animals, livestock activities will pump another 86 gigatons of CO2 into our atmosphere from land use change alone by 2050. But if the world adopts the Eat Lancet diet, reducing meat by 70%, the land we could release back to nature would remove 332 gigatons of CO2 from our atmosphere by 2050. And this does not include the positive impact of reducing methane and nitrous oxide. Vegan diets remove even more CO2. Importantly, the researchers also found that even if we gave all of livestock's land back to nature, we could still produce more than enough protein for every human on Earth using the remaining cropland. And imagine the habitat we could restore for endangered species. Now, a logical question is, how can we convince livestock and feed crop farmers to set aside land for carbon sequestration? Well, it'll take a lot of thought, but we can learn from the example of Costa Rica. In the 1970s and 80s, Costa Rica had one of the highest deforestation rates in Latin America, with tree cover falling from 75% of its territory to about 25% between the 1940s and 1987. Thankfully, the Costa Rican government, with the support of the people, recognized the value of its forests and introduced the Payments for Environmental Services, or PES program, that paid owners of land in forest areas for carbon mitigation, hydrological services, biodiversity protection, and landscape beauty. Today, about 52% of Costa Rica is once again forest. The government financed the program through a gasoline tax, and since they now plan to decarbonize their economy, they're looking for new ways to finance it. Nonetheless, we can learn a lot from their success. So how does everything I've talked about translate into emissions from specific foods? Here we see the global average greenhouse gas emissions to produce 100 grams of protein of each of these foods. Beef emissions far exceed emissions from other animal and plant foods. And here you see emissions from dairy cow beef, cheese, and milk. Producing beef emits about 20 times more greenhouse gases than producing legumes. And producing pork and chicken emits about 3 times more greenhouse gases than producing legumes. Now, according to the Natural Resources Defense Council, if every American were to cut just 1/4 pound of beef from their diet per week, it would be like taking 10 million cars off the road for 1 year. And according to World Resources Institute, if just the 2 billion of us high consumers cut our meat and dairy consumption by 40%, we would save an area of land twice the size of India and avoid 168 gigatons of future greenhouse gas emissions. Furthermore, this scenario could free up enough land to feed 10 billion people by 2050 without destroying more forests for agriculture. Now let's move on to tropical deforestation and other habitat conversion. This chart shows the drivers of tropical deforestation averaged over the years 2005 to 2013. Researchers note that drivers have not changed much since 2013. Beef is the #1 driver, responsible for 41%, followed by oil seeds, namely palm oil and soybeans at 18.4%. So let's dive into beef and soybeans. From Latin America to Africa to Australia, forests are being destroyed to create cattle pasture to meet the world's growing demand for beef. Beef's highest impact is in Central and South America, and especially Brazil. From 1990 to 2005, beef was responsible for 71% of total deforestation in South America and remains the #1 driver today. In 2018, 81% of deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon, which contains more species than anywhere else on Earth, was for cattle pasture. Eventually, soybean plantations expand onto those pastures, pushing cattle ranchers deeper into the forest. And the majority of global soybean production isn't for humans, it's for animal feed, 77%. Now, right here in the US, we lost grasslands across the Great Plains at an average rate of 4 football fields per minute. From 2014 to 2018, most tilling of US grasslands is for corn and soybeans, two crops whose primary destination is livestock feed. Now, it's worth noting here that the livestock sector is the largest user of land on Earth. Agriculture uses 50% of the planet's habitable land, and 83% of agricultural land is used for pasture and feed crops. Yet, the livestock sector only produces 37% of the world's protein and 18% of our calories. 34% of the entire world's crop production goes to feeding livestock. Now, it's really important to note here that the soybeans and corn grown in places like Brazil and the US are not just feeding livestock in those countries, but are also feeding livestock in places like Europe and especially China to meet demand for chicken, pork, beef, and dairy in those countries. The result is that ecosystems, land, and water in Brazil and the US are being degraded, depleted, and polluted to meet not just domestic demand for animal source foods, but also to meet growing international demand for these foods. Exporting soybeans and corn means more profit for the Brazilian and American feed crop industries, but it comes at a cost of even greater devastation to the natural environment in Brazil and the US. For example, here are a couple of articles that expose how China's hunger for soybeans is driving environmental devastation in Brazil. Now, we humans have essentially turned our planet into one big livestock farm. Together, livestock and humans now make up 96% of the global mammal biomass on the planet. 60% is livestock, 36% is humans, and wild mammals now account for only a tiny 4%. 70% of the birds on the planet are now chickens and other poultry, and only 30% are wild birds. Since 1970, populations of mammals, birds, fish, and reptiles have declined by 68% globally and by 94% in Latin America. As the World Wildlife Fund's Executive Director of Science and Conservation said, we are sleepwalking towards the edge of a cliff. The main drivers of biodiversity decline continue to be agriculture, land conversion, and the overexploitation of species. And as we've seen, livestock production is the biggest user of the world's agricultural land, and beef and oil seeds, including soybeans, are the primary drivers globally of conversion of land to agricultural use. Okay, let's move on to water. Manure and other waste from industrialized livestock operations and slaughterhouses, together with fertilizers and pesticides applied to feed crops, are flowing into waterways around the world, contributing to algae blooms, fish kills, ocean dead zones, and contaminated drinking water. For example, according to the Center for Biological Diversity, concentrated animal feeding operations, or CAFOs, have polluted 35,000 miles of rivers in the US and contaminated groundwater in 17 states. 75% of the world's fresh water is used for crop or livestock production. And generally, producing animal source foods uses far more water than producing plant foods, primarily due to feed crop irrigation. According to Water Footprint Network, producing 1 kilogram of beef protein requires over 15,000 liters, or about 4,000 gallons of water. This is 4 times more water than needed to produce 1 kilogram of pulses. Now, in the US, the primary user of our river water is cattle feed crops. A March 2020 study published in Nature found that irrigation of cattle feed consumes 23% of all river water nationally, 32% in the Western US, and 55% in the Colorado River Basin. The Western US has been in a mega drought for 20 years, yet we are devoting the largest portion of our river water to feeding cows. Now, I'd like to make a few final points about species decline. Many people don't realize this, but right here in the US, we are losing tens of thousands of our native predators every single year to protect livestock. From 2015 to 2019, a taxpayer-funded USDA agency called Wildlife Services killed or euthanized 371,000 native predators, including coyotes, foxes, bobcats, black bears, wolves, mountain lions, eagles, grizzly bears, at the request of private ranchers to protect their livestock. We taxpayers pay Wildlife Services to kill our native predators so that private livestock owners don't lose money. In an analysis on their website, Wildlife Services calculates that for every federal dollar spent on predation management, $10.88 is saved in livestock is saved. Now, most of us have never heard of this agency, and because it operates in relative secrecy, and that might be because it uses cruel and inhumane killing methods. Those methods include poisoned bait, neck snares, aerial gunning, cyanide bombs, leg hold traps, which are banned in 80 countries, in which you see here, and even hunting dogs that are trained to catch and kill animals like coyotes. And last, our appetite for fish is emptying our oceans. 94% of the world's fisheries are already either maximally fished or overfished. We have lost 66% of our large predatory fish in just the last 100 years, and 88% of fisheries will be overfished by 2050 if we continue with today's practices. Tragically, populations of other marine creatures like dolphins, sharks, whales, and turtles are plummeting since many get caught in fishing nets and die. And discarded and lost fishing gear is the largest source of plastic pollution in our oceans, and it continues killing marine life and damaging ecosystems for decades. So how do we fix this? Well, I don't have all the answers, but I do know that we need to act now. And the most important step is for all of us who can to shift to a plant-rich diet starting today. And I invite all of you to go to plantrichchallenge.org to register for the global 30-day plant-rich diet challenge that the SRAG Plant-Rich Diet Task Force is holding in October. Next, we urgently need to get this issue into the national dialogue and get legislators on board. And once we do, here are some ideas that I propose. First, let's regulate methane emissions from animal agriculture. In April of 2021, 25 organizations devoted to environmental justice, rural community health, and environmental health petitioned the EPA to regulate emissions from industrialized hog and dairy farms and move the nation toward pasture-based farming with sustainable herd sizes. In addition, California passed a law in 2016 requiring a 40% reduction in methane emissions from dairies by 2030. Let's devise a national system to incentivize hardworking family farmers to diversify out of animal agriculture and into nature-positive plant-based operations, and to set aside land for carbon sequestration. Now, there's a really interesting bill that's been introduced in California to pay farmers to set aside land to conserve water. Perhaps the language could be leveraged into a national bill to pay farmers to dedicate land to non-animal uses. And this might be a better use of the tens of billions in annual taxpayer dollars going towards subsidizing the production of livestock products. Let's teach plant-rich nutrition to kids in K through 12 and to the public for free through county health departments and public assistance programs. Not only would this be good for planetary health, but it would drastically improve human health. Research has unequivocally shown that plant-based diets can prevent and in many cases even reverse many of the chronic diseases that are killing millions of people globally every year, causing untold suffering and costing our nation and our world trillions of dollars in healthcare costs. And last, let's reduce or eliminate subsidies to meat, dairy, and feed crop producers so that their products are priced by market forces rather than being artificially cheap due to subsidies. We also need to financially support producers of healthy crops for direct human consumption. The USDA dietary guidelines urge Americans to fill half our plate with fruits and vegetables, yet less than 1% of agricultural subsidies, which totaled $46 billion in 2020, go towards specialty crops, including vegetables and fruits. Of the $424 billion in subsidies dispersed between 1995 and 2020, at least 43% went to corn, soybeans, livestock, and dairy. And here's a great quote that says it all. A diet rich in vegetables and fruits can lower blood pressure, reduce the risk of heart disease and stroke, prevent some types of cancer, lower risk of eye and digestive problems, and have a positive effect upon blood sugar, which can help keep appetite in check. Farm bills do almost nothing for fruits and vegetables. If there's any obligation to spend the public's money in a way that is consistent with public health, shouldn't subsidies benefit fruits and vegetables? Okay, now I know that all of the proposals I just put forth are really bold, but we're Rotary, for heaven's sakes. Now, in the end, it is up to each of us to choose what is more important to us. Continuing to eat more than we need of this, or saving this. Let's make the right choice. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to take questions.
Andrea, would you please provide us with your email address? We will skip the questions. We will write to you questions directly if you don't mind.
That would be fine. Thank you.
In the chat box, please put your address. Anybody else can copy the address and ask the questions directly to Andrea. Thank you very much. It was a very enlightening presentation and we appreciate it.